In 1868, an American inventor by the name of Charles Skoll was granted the first patent for the world's first typewriter. There was only one problem. It worked so well, people were typing so fast, that it broke all the time. See, the first patterns of the keys mirrored something that the users were familiar with, the A through Z pattern, which is why they were typing so fast. So Charles would take the next 7 years, and he finally stumbled upon how to solve the problem. He figured out the most complex configuration of a keyboard. We now still call this the QWERTY keyboard. That's right, folks. Let that sink in. For the past 142 years, you've been typing harder, not smarter, definitely slower, and not faster. How about another notion that we just blindly accept, but I don't think we should, which is the idea of retiring at 65. Now, most people have no idea why this is, but if you think about the amount of time and energy that goes into planning this magical number, I think we should. Well, it turns out, right around the turn of the 20th century, in Germany, there was a chancellor who was facing some fierce political competition from all of his rivals who were all over the age of 65. So instead of beating him the old-fashioned way, he decided to create a mandatory law that made the age to retire 65 and older, which is how we got the inspiration to still do this today. How about another notion that fires me up as a dad of an 11-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son who are here today? How about the idea of school bells? Anybody know why we still have school bells? Well, during the Industrial Revolution, when all of us worked on the factory floor, we were just starting to learn about the ideas of increased productivity and conditioning of behavior. In fact, the famous experimenter, Dr. Pavlov, who did the bells with the dogs to condition their behavior, that's why we start a shift with a bell and we end a shift with a bell. So we applied that logic to the factory floor and said, hey, why not get those kids early, getting ready to work on the factory floor to condition them? And folks, we still use those today. So why do I know all these fun facts? Well, one of my favorite sayings is that we teach what we need to learn and we create what we need to heal. A bit of a confession for the guy who's going to talk about the future of work. My first and last job in corporate America was more than 20 years ago, and it only lasted about a month. I mean, after the first week, I was like, all right, let me get this straight. So we're all going to wake up unusually early. We're going to put on clothes we normally wouldn't wear. We're going to drive a long commute. We're going to get to an office that is stale and stiff. We're going to be around people that we can't authentically be ourselves. We're going to eat a rushed lunch, and we're going to go home at the end of the day a lot less of ourselves as opposed to more. Folks, it is a tragic truth that we spend the majority of our time at work. So my moonshot, my mission for the past 20 years has been to, how do you change the way people work so it transforms the way they live, so that they can go home more of themselves? Now, I've done this as an investor, an entrepreneur, a consultant. My company has helped work with more than 600 plus organizations trying to make this change. And we've collected a lot of data too. You want to know what's holding us back from the workplace? Why it's so miserable? Why work isn't working? Legacy thinking. The idea that the past equals the future, it's a bias in our thinking. You know, why do we type on a QWERTY keyboard? Because we've always done it that way. Why do we retire at 65? Because it is what it is. Folks, it is sort of like we're like rowing a boat, paddling forward, but we're looking back. I think it's time to wake up, turn around, face forward, and it's time to question everything. Now, I get that this is a big ask for lots of humans who typically, when it comes to change, we don't like it, right? We have a bit of an immunity to change. In fact, how many of us have set New Year's resolutions, right? How many of us have also forgotten them, right? And so I know it can seem a little hopeless, but one of my favorite quotes is, don't have hope, be hope. Now, we all have these things called phones. We call them smartphones. You're probably having it in your hand right now. But you want to know what makes it smart? It's the idea that when it's broke or when there's a bug, it updates its software. When's the last time you updated your software? When's the last time you updated the software at work? Fun fact, The average child asks 125 questions a day when the average adult only asks 6. Folks, we've been conditioning each other to not ask the tough questions. And instead of having another sage on the stage tell you what the future of work is going to be, how about we try something different? How about we assume that no one knows you better than you? That your voice and your vote is the only one that matters. So it starts off by saying, who says? Who says it has to be done that way? And for today, who says the future of work can't be more human and not less? Now look, this is not going to be your normal conversation up here, so I would say buckle up. This is going to take a lot more courage than comfort. So let's start. Who says work has to suck? It is a fact, not a feeling. If the majority of us hit the lotto today, tomorrow, we'd be cashing in that check, singing that song by Johnny Paycheck, "Take this job and shove it." For sure. And as you think about this, Gallup has been studying the workplace for more than decades. 70% of the American workforce is not engaged. I mean, again, it seems a bit hopeless. But for me, I've got a bit of a different relationship with work. See, I look at work as actually having saved my life. I grew up in Baltimore City during a really tough time in a really tough place. And I've got this unique story because in one hand, I went to statistically the worst high school in the state of Maryland. We started off with 965 freshmen. We graduated 235 seniors 4 years later. But on the other hand, I also have this weird part of my story that I went to one of the best colleges in the country at the Johns Hopkins University. So obviously the question is, how did you go from one of the worst environments to one of the best environments? He's also here today, my dad. Thank you. Now, he is by far the hardest working, most honorable, most humble person I've ever met in my life. You know how they talk about parenting? Sometimes it's better to be an example than an explanation. That's my dad. I mean, I watched a front row seat to him changing his stars and breaking the cycle. In fact, I remember watching him go to work every day, and he would never complain. I couldn't figure it out. He used to even say this to me all the time, "Joe, I don't have to work. I get to work." I want you to think about that. I get to work. I get to return emails. I get to do meetings. I get to do performance reviews. Yeah, it's a subtle shift of agency, but it was a huge awakening for me. And apparently, in this moment, I'm not the only one. We've all heard this thing called the Great Resignation. 40+ million Americans are voting with their feet. The pandemic inspired us to slow things down. We're starting to ask different questions. And I think the one question we're all asking of ourselves is today worth it? Is this worth my life? And instead of listening from here, we're listening from here, just like my dad did. So folks, the future of work is in your hands. Your voice and your vote is the only one that matters. But look, most people get to this part and they say, "I get it. I get to work, makes total sense, but Joe, you have no idea. I work for a big company and they don't get it." Well, who says your company won't change? Look, I get it. The Harvard Business Review said that 70% of change fails, and I think a lot of that is because it's a have to versus a get to, for sure. But I think if you zoom out, you see that every organization is literally shaped the exact same way. We have been all stuck in this thinker-doer model for a long period of time, and it embeds a code, if you will, an adult-to-child relationship. We tell grown adults where to be, when to be, how to be, and why to be. This is not the way to, for the past 20 years, I've tried to talk to executives and say, treat people like adults and they'll act like adults. Freedom, flexibility, and fairness. But it took a pandemic. In fact, March 16th, 2020, jot that down, it was the day it all shifted. It was the day that nearly every company in this country decided to operate from a totally different place. They allowed their folks, most of their knowledge workers, to work from home. And it kind of worked. It wasn't great or perfect all the time, but that was an option that was always on the table. What are the other options? How about not just where we work, but why, when, and how? I love the example of Airbnb. They just came out with this. They said, not only can you work from anywhere, but we're going to plus that up. Instead of adjusting your compensation because you live in a different city, we're just going to assume that the value you produce is the value you produce. Next day, they had 800,000 page views on their career pages. Another amazing example, Tower Paddleboards, a company out of California, has been playing around with a 5-hour workday. How many people would be excited about a 5-hour workday? So folks, the future of work is in our hands. If we want Fridays off, then let's just collectively make that decision and find a way to make it work, yes? Exactly. So the future of work starts with the question, who says, who says, who says? But I know we've been conditioned that when you say who says, what do we say? They say. Newsflash, there is no they. Now look, I know this sounds a lot more of a personal conversation than a professional one, but remember, the tragic truth is we spend the majority of our time at work, so don't tell me it's not personal. How many of us have ever heard the line, it's just business, it's not personal? Who says work isn't personal? Look, I get it. Before the pandemic, we'd all show up to work with our suits on, our swords, our shields, our heels, our ties, our masks. Some of you are still doing that today for some reason, and that's fine. But during the pandemic over the last 2 years, we've got a chance to be with each other in a different way. You've Zoomed with people in their homes. What gets more personal than that? Now look, this isn't new news. One of the biggest and arguably one of the better employers, Google, has been studying the workplace for decades. In fact, they came out with a famous study that they called Project Aristotle in 2016. They wanted to see what would actually drive high performance. Well, here's the punchline. Psychological safety. Well, what does that mean? It's a fancy way of saying people want to be seen, safe, and supported. Not a pressure cooker. Not a controlled environment where you demand compliance, but an environment where people can be themselves, where, frankly, they feel like you have their back. Now, I grew up on the streets. I can tell you there's no better feeling than that. So the future of work can be more human and not less. And by the way, when it's more human, it will also be more profitable, according to Google, more productive, according to Google, and higher performing. But there are still people that are going to hear this and are not going to update their software. They're going to go back to the exact way that they were rowing the boat all before this. And if you work in an organization like that that will not update its software, then it's time to vote with your feet. Because one of my favorite parts about this, is that as we turn around and face forward and we stop trying to figure out the future because of the past, we start to see that we're actually capable of all these things that were unthinkable once, which kind of tracks with this whole conference today, right? Mavericks and moonshots. We're here to make a dent. We're here to make a difference. We're here to leave a legacy. We're here to leave our mark. But just hold on. What do you mean, our mark? More names on buildings and more names on organizations? I don't think we need any more of that, yes? So who says you need to leave a personal legacy? MIT. Most people have heard this very prestigious organization. How about William Barton Rogers? Anybody hear of him? Yeah, he was the founder. How about TED? We're here today. Pretty popular thing, yes? Founded by a guy named Richard Saul Wurman. These guys knew that legacy, it's not what you do, it's what you help others do. Now for me, this is kind of personal. I'm also here today because of my mom, and I lost her when I was 23. She was 45 when she died, the same age I am here today. So every day I get, every moment I get is a day that she doesn't. And she was a force to be reckoned with, trust me. She was loving, she was kind, she was passionate. She was also an aspiring actress. So I'm here today because of her sacrifices and struggles too. But in large part, I'm here because my parents decided to play a different game, right? Like the game that we decided on March 16th, 2020. We all collectively said, hey, why don't we try leading from not this fear place, but this love place? Why don't we start trusting people instead of always be thinking about this short-term greed? You know, it's time to start playing a different game that maybe we're not victims of our circumstances. We don't walk around saying, I have to anymore, but I get to. There's a real attitude of gratitude to just be alive, yes? Or how about a different game where we stop treating each other less than human? Look, just acknowledge, look around. We're all brothers and sisters sitting on a rock, hurling through the universe right now at 67,000 miles an hour, by the way. And how about we play a different game where it's not about the glory for ourselves, but we stop playing the me game, we start playing a we game, and we start planting sequoias. Sequoias are these things that are going to grow for hundreds of years, and we know that when we plant these seeds like you all and we all will do today, we'll never see it fully grown, ever. But that's why it's worth it. Folks, the future of work can be more human and not less. Will it be easy? No, but it'll be worth it. It'll help you be a better you, it'll help us be a better us, and it'll help all of us be a better all. Now look, the call to action, yes, is who says, who says, who says. That is the message. But if you just want to cut to the chase and get to the end, it's really about what say you. Thank you.